Let's see. Here we go. Well, good evening. We are just about a minute away from getting started. There's typically a 30-second gap between this, and I'm going to give probably another minute just to allow people to start checking in who are coming live. This is a series of talks on the Cruciform Way, a study of leadership and humility, and really trying to both establish a biblical understanding of what it means to try to cultivate humility, especially in the context of being called to be a leader. And I want to thank you for joining with me. One of the things that I'm hoping for is that, especially as you engage in these talks, to get feedback from people just about how you're experiencing it. Is the way that the content is being delivered, is it readily accessible? If I'm losing anybody in spots, please let me know. And I really think that and believe this is important stuff for every Christian. And I think that humility is a character virtue, not only that Jesus wants to have formed in every one of us because it's so central to who he is, but it is, I'll eventually get to this place where I'll say it's a special virtue because it's a virtue that helps elevate all the other virtues. It helps every other virtue find its right place and even in many ways cultivate those virtues. Now, where we are today is we are in the process of building a biblical understanding of humility and leadership. We've done word studies, and now we've put this all in the context of understanding the church as the locus of the place which we are part of, and understanding the culture of who Jesus says the church is supposed to be through images that focus both on the being of the church and the doing of the church. And right now, having examined the words for humility and leadership, we are moving forward. I haven't yet given you my working definition for humility. We're building the pieces towards it. And last week we were able to begin the discussion about honor-shame culture. And I'm making an argument that in order for us to really understand the biblical idea of humility, we need to have an appreciation, a historical appreciation of one of the great differences and one of the features of the Greco-Roman world that is different from ours, and to realize that they approached honor and shame, and they approached the desire for honor in a way that is truly different from our society. And those differences create tension, where when we come to the reading of the New Testament and we don't have that framework of just an understanding of the flavor of their world, we will miss some of what they were pointing to. And today we're going to be getting into 4 specific passages. We'll probably just be able to get into 2 today, and then we'll hit the other 2 next week, where we'll see this intersection of leadership and humility. We'll be reading these passages in light of the honor-shame culture, as well as just giving you commentary about all the background information of what was going on in the episodes and the dynamics that were being worked out. I hope and I think that today will be quite interesting. These passages are all significant. They all have, and I think they will all be illuminated in ways that if you haven't had this appreciation of honor-shame culture and the background into some of these specific issues, that you'll hear these passages with a little bit more light and clarity. With that, let us begin. And so, In stepping back into the Greco-Roman culture, we must leave the values and assumptions of egalitarianism behind. We have been born into a country that was shaped by the gospel. Sometimes with clear understanding it was being shaped by the gospel. And other times really just unconsciously, because this country was birthed in Christendom. And in particular, the idea that all people are created equal. And very thankful, obviously, for the progress that we've made, where our working definition, by and large, while there may be pockets of racism within the U.S., by and large, most people are working off the idea that when we say all people, we mean every tribe, every tongue, every nation, every color of people, that all of us are human beings created in the image of God and therefore equal. And that idea of egalitarianism has had a huge impact on the way that we see the world. When we step back into the Greco-Roman world, they did not see that as a virtue. They did not, that was not their world. They didn't even agree with that. That was an entirely different way of structuring society, and it was one that they rejected. There was a pecking order. One of the easiest analogies is that, if you've ever flown and there's the differences between coach and first class, imagine that sort of feel, though with many extra levels. So there's not just class and business and coach, but there's more tiers, and every level of society is stratified. Every level of society looks to reinforce those things. You are boxed in to a certain level, and you're basically stuck there. And they were, and as I shared last week, this pecking order was jealously guarded, and in particular by Roman citizens, and especially the elite of Roman society. They used clothes and titles and citizenship and clans. They used where somebody sat at a table or a banquet at a sporting event. And all of these were markers of rank and significance and status. It determined one's behavior, relationships, legal privileges. And that's the part where you were in society depended on how much justice you had. Where you were in society dictated how people treated you, and if they treated you well or if they treated you more poorly. It cannot be too strongly emphasized that the honor due rank meant everything to Roman citizens. So when we're stepping into Greco-Roman society, we're stepping into an honor-shame culture. And and we'll talk more about this, where in our society, some people may pursue money, some people may pursue power, some people may pursue significance, some people may pursue security. By and large, in the Greco-Roman world, what people were pursuing above all else was honor. For Christians, we know that what we're pursuing is the glory of God, to put God first in our lives. And right here is this contest, the way of Jesus and the way of the Greco-Roman world. And one is really this self-promotion, what I'm doing for myself. And the other is Godward focused. And there was battle here. And one of the things within this is humility is right at the contest. Now, I want to paint for you a little bit of a picture of just kind of the way that the ancient world was separated. The ancient world, Greco-Roman society, was basically a two-class society. And you had citizens, and then you had non-citizens. But within even the citizenship and non-citizen, there was further division. And this is the two-class division. At the top, and just to give you like raw numbers, approximately about 50 million people in the Roman Empire during the New Testament period. Of that 50 million people, 1 million, so 2%, made up the upper status of society, and the name that was given to them in Latin is the Honestiores, and they were basically the elites. The rest, the 49 million, were called the Humiliaries, the lowly. And notice the close association of Humiliaries with humiliation and humility. Now, guess who made up all these names, and guess who reinforced all these things? The people at the top. And part of this, in the whole honor-shame culture, and if you've ever really seen a pecking order, we had chickens when I was a kid. And, you know, it reminds you of nature red in tooth and claw. And you see that poor chicken that has the back with all the feathers pulled out of it because, well, that one's at the bottom of the pecking order. Well, the ones at the top wanted to feel good at the top. And part of the way that they felt good at the top was by recognizing that they're not on the bottom and making the people on the bottom not feel good because you're not on the top. And so being humiliated was a common occurrence for people. And it was the thing that those who wanted honor and glory, they wanted to avoid at all costs. It sounds mean, doesn't it? It sounds harsh. It sounds cruel. And it was. This is part of what the Christian gospel brought into the world, was a humanizing, was a kindness, was a gentleness that was lacking before. Now, you've got the two major classes, 2% of society, the Honestiores, and then the 49, and then the Humiliaries. Now, within that upper class, there were three major segments, and you would call these orders. At the very top would be the senators, and then their families. And then the next level down was the equestrian class. And going back into the military, these were the ones who could afford horses. That wasn't really the case now by the time that we're in the empire, but there's this name. Of course, they could afford horses. But this knightly sort of a class, and they weren't as high up as the senators, but they were the next tier down. And then underneath them is the decurions. Now, the most important determining factor about what class you are in. So what status? Are you part of the Honestiores or are you part of the Humiliaries? And then, which order within? Are you part of the senators or are you part of the equestrian or are you part of the decurions? Was your birth. This was not an upwardly mobile society. It was almost impossible for somebody who was born in a lower social status to actually climb up into a higher order. Every once in a while, something like that may happen, but it was very rare. They wanted to keep it small. They wanted to guard their special privileges. They wanted it to be elite because, well, it's good to be at the top, and I don't want to be at the bottom, and so we're not going to let very many people up here. Now, what's interesting is that in the non-elite class, the Humiliaries, there were also three different orders. At the top, you had the freeborn, and these would be citizens, and they were born as free and as citizens. And then you would have freedmen, and then in the freedmen, there would be citizens and non-citizens. And you could have that same distinction in the freedmen. There would be citizens and there would be non-citizens. There was more status for being a citizen, and you could buy citizenship, but if you couldn't afford it, then you'd be a non-citizen. But by and large, if you were born free, that was better than if you were born a slave and then you bought your freedom. But if you had been born a slave and you bought your freedom, you would be known as a freedman. And then there were two different status levels you could reach. There was a citizen and there was a non-citizen, and then there were the slaves, and so two major groups with three different orders in each group, and that was the basic structure. Now, I'll read you a quote that comes from Joseph Hellerman. During the early imperial period, it saw 600 aristocrats fill the Senate. So at the very top of Roman society, the people with the most power, the most prestige, they were really the ruling elite. There was about 600 senators, and then they had wives and children. And that made up the top of the Roman Empire. Underneath them was the equestrian order, and there was about 20,000 men who occupied the equestrian order, and then they would have their wives, and then they would have their children, and this would make up the next group. And then in the next group down, and both the senators and equestrians by and large lived in Rome. Sometimes they would go out into the provinces to really try to get honor, to do something, to make a name for themselves. And then below them were the decorians. And the decorians were basically the ruling elites for all the provinces. And these were the people who helped run the Roman Empire throughout the Roman Empire. And there was about 150 to 200,000 of these men, and then their wives and their children. And so when you take the senators, the equestrians, and then the decorians, and then you take your wives and their children, that basically was your million people. A decorian looked up to the equestrians, looked up to the senators, wished that they could be them, almost impossible for them to rise up there. The equestrians looked down at the decorians and would use them as a means to make themselves feel better because they're better. But they would look up to the senators, aspiring, wishing that they could have that level of status, but knowing that it was impossible to reach. And at the very top were the senators, and they looked down on everybody else. And they basically, when those 600 men looked down on everybody else, they looked at all those people as really just merely existing so that they might have honor. They were tools. They were things to be used. They didn't really matter except in how they helped me, because I'm at the top, feel better about myself, or even achieve higher distinction. And this became, so we're kind of just getting a picture of the society. Birth was the major determining factor. Out of the birth, you see one of the features of basically every honor shame culture. There's a great concern for protecting the family name. The most important thing about you, as far as establishing your honor in society, has nothing to do with you, what actually you do. It's what comes to you because you were born. And so there becomes that part where there's great onus that I don't want to bring any shame upon my family name, because if I were to ruin this and in some way we were to lose our status because of what I did, I wouldn't be able to live with myself, and our whole family would be lost. In the ancient world, they typically start with the community and they move to the individual. Again, one of the differences of our society and their society. And in part it has to do with the whole honor shame and where the honor comes from. And the primary indicator is where I was born. There is a huge difference between being born a Roman citizen and purchasing one's citizenship. The emphasis for birth determining status was reflective of both the way Romans guarded their status and the difficulty of moving between two classes. There's a conversation that Paul has with a Roman elite in the book of Acts. And that's where Paul then finally reveals he's a Roman citizen. And this Roman elite at the time actually had to purchase his citizenship. And Paul is able to say, I was born a Roman citizen. And we'll miss something if we don't understand that right there, Paul has a higher social status than this Roman official that he's dealing with, because here's somebody who had to buy their citizenship, and Paul was born a Roman citizen. Now, you've got this two-class society, you've got the different social orders, and the thing that they want more than anything else is honor and glory. They want distinction. And where you were born is the major part. But let's say that you're at the very top. You're one of the 600 senators. But you're not satisfied with just being at the top of one of 600. The real honor comes where you could stand out even from those 600. And this became a competition. How do I make distinction from the rest of the people that are in my status of society? And this became known as the race for honor. And the race for honor was what basically life was about for those at the top. And now this was the main thing. And this is the part where when we think about what do people go for in American culture, they go for money, they go for security, they go for comfort, they go for love, something like that. Christians, what we should be aiming for is the glory of God. In the ancient world, what they were going for was honor. And so these senators ran the race for honor. And what happened was that they created special orders within their status level, their strata of society. Among the senators, there were two basic categories: the new men and the nobles. And the new men were the top, and these were the ones who were able to get the highest seats and had the most authority. And then during the Republic, that shifted in the empire, where then you had the emperor. And now the emperor becomes the very top. And then underneath, there's still this desire of, in the old system, how do I get to be the new man status? And it used to be that you would be proconsul, and there would be 2 or 3 of you that would be ruling at the same time, depending on what part of Roman history you were talking about. And you would do that for a period of time. And if you reached that level, you know, that was something. It wasn't the only thing, though. They became benefactors. They sponsored games. They built buildings, and their names would be associated with these things. And these all became ways that they distinguished themselves. And this is the part where money became an issue, but money wasn't the goal. Money was the tool to get to the goal, which was honor. And so at the very top, if you wanted to be a new man, it meant that you had to have a certain amount of wealth, because you needed to actually do a certain number of things. It was expected of you that you would spend so much money on building projects and so much money on hosting gladiatorial games, so that if you're going to have that level in society, you've done these sorts of things, because other people can't do those sorts of things, so they don't deserve the glory and honor that we do that's associated with that title. That's what life was about, the race for honor. The values of the great trickled down throughout the rest of society. And so it ended up that in every class and in every order, they mimicked the race for honors at the top. And so let's say that you were part of the humiliaries, and you were born a free person. Well, they created different sorts of guilds. Let's say that you were an iron worker, and there would be an iron worker guild. And then within that guild, there could be ways for you to reach the top of that guild. and to get that special title. And then among your peers in your status, you would receive greater honor than somebody who never made that mark. And this is the way it was all through the Roman Empire. One of the things to know is that when Paul's writing to the Philippians, this is going to play a backdrop a little bit, because Philippi was the most Roman colony with the most loyalty to Rome out of any of the churches that we have as far as in Asia Minor, where we get the letters of Paul being written. And they took this race for honors. And, well, this is part of just the nature of humans. Because of the fall, because of sin, because we're broken, because we are afraid that maybe we really don't have worth, because, well, we have shame because of fall, we have the feeling of guilt. And so we want things to tell us that we matter. And so pride rears its ugly head. And the race for pride. And we play this game where I make myself feel better by tearing somebody else down. And then in the church, there's leadership structures. And man, it sounds better to be an elder than just to be a member. And, and I'd probably rather be an elder than just a deacon, because the word deacons means servant and elder means ruler. And so, if I'm going for something, I'm going to go for the elder thing. And we do know, right, that has always played out in the church, where there are these things where we are ending up playing that old game of the way the world is. And that's an issue that was going on in the early church. It's an issue when we get into Philippians we will talk about again. But this race for honor mimicked itself at every level of society. It was even infiltrating the way of the church. Just so you know, read 1 Corinthians and Paul's correction to the church in Corinth of how they were doing the celebrating communion. And when he's talking about the fact that there's judgment coming upon you and people are getting sick because the way that you are doing communion is the way the world was doing communion, or the way the world was, they were mimicking the race for honor. The great in the church, the wealthy, the people of the highest status, they came in and they took the best seats in the house. This was the way that the society was structured. All of these things said something. I'll fill in for you a little bit, just kind of getting the feel of that society. The Roman position expressed by Cicero, one of their great orators and statements: by nature we yearn and hunger for honor, and once we have glimpsed, as it were, some part of its radiance, there is nothing we are not prepared to bear and suffer in order to secure it. And there you hear the passion of the Roman position. That's what life is about. Honor, glory, hope, they all go together. In a world that was skeptical about the afterlife, the race for honor was the clearest attempt in some way to reach into transcendence with the hope for a positive future. Remember, most Greco-Romans, the afterlife was kind of this dark, shadowy place, not quite sure. A lot of the stories of Greek mythology and Roman mythology kind of picture it as something that's less than. And so what you're looking for is you're looking to distinguish yourself so that your name and your honor goes on, because that may be the most important thing that lasts. And at the very highest hope is that if in some way you really make it, like you reach the pinnacle, well, remember that there are stars in the heavens that get constellations named after them, and there is Hercules up there, and we can see him, and his name has been written up in the sky, and his honor and his glory will shine forward forever. I don't know what exactly is going to happen, but if I can get my name written in the stars, well, I've made it. I'm at the top. Bruce Molina and Jerome Nairi offer the following definition of honor as it was conceived in the ancient world. Honor was the positive value of a person in his or her own eyes, plus the positive appreciation of that person in the eyes of his or her social group. It wasn't just what you thought about yourself, but it was also what others, especially among your peers, thought of you. Every society utilizes honor and shame as a means of upholding societal norms, as well as recognizing exemplary behaviors. What distinguishes the Greco-Roman society is that achieving honor was the primary goal of human existence. Now, what goes along with this desire for honor is to get the recognition that's due my status. And so one of the interesting things about Romans is not only were they racing for the honor that they wanted their names to be esteemed, but they wanted to hear that their names were esteemed. And and this is the part where, we human beings, we always typically look at ourselves through rose-colored glasses. And when you start playing a game that at its root is competitive and is based on envy and resentment and competition and winning. And remember the metaphor that I shared a number of weeks ago about the stomp game and a zero-sum game where I win, you lose. And in this world, the race for honors, there's only one person at the very top. And I may not be able to get there, but, I want to get there in my little social status. And so I'm going to stomp on everybody else. Now, in all of this, it's not only how I see myself, but it's how everybody else also sees me in this same way. But, I probably think about myself more than other people think about me. And so one of the things that went along with this is not only my concern for honor and then being recognized for it, but I'm not hearing it enough. So one of the things that characterizes the entire culture is self-display and boasting and telling people what you've done so that they will know what you've done, and then they will give you the honor that obviously you are due. The goal in Greco-Roman society was to be seen. Plutarch observed, most people think that to be deprived of the chance to display wealth is to be deprived of wealth itself. I mean, this is the part where in that society, it was about showing off. If you had it, you showed it because you wanted people to honor you and go, oh, if I could only be them. The lack of privacy in the cities became a breeding ground for public display. And for the wealthy, it became the instant opportunity to win applause and acclaim for their obvious greatness. The role of benefactor was not about mercy, but about building one's own reputation. More often than not, the things that were built, the things that were given, they weren't coming from a heart of compassion. They were coming from a heart that wanted to be seen and wanted to receive honor for what it had done. One little picture, and this again gives a little bit of light to the situation in Corinth with how they were celebrating the Lord's Supper. In contemporary society, we share meals to express a sense of shared identity. We're friends. We want to get to know somebody, and so we invite them over and we share this life. And it's saying that we're friends. We're mutual. We're sharing life together. This is not how it was done in the ancient world. Romans invited persons across the social spectrum to their banquets in order to showcase their superiority. And so I'll give you like a picture. So let's say you're a Decorian. Let's say you're at the top of the heap, and I'll use Philippi. So you're a leading person of Philippi, and there is a Roman general that's coming to town. So you're going to hold a banquet, and you're going to put that Roman general in the seat of honor, and you're going to sit right next to them because you're like the greatest person in the city, and here is somebody who's even higher up than you, and you're sitting next to them, and you want as many people as you can who can see it, but everybody has their place because there's a pecking order. And not only does your seating determine where you are, but the food that you get determines where you are. And they're going to invite some rabble in from the street, and they're going to be out in the outer courtyard, and they're going to be getting crumbs to eat while you have a lavish meal. And part of this is to show that you're great and they're not, and you're eating meat and they're getting crumbs. And this is the way the society functioned and thought it was all normal and right and appropriate. And that's what was going on in Corinth. The rich and wealthy were coming in and they were having a lavish meal, and it was all part of the love feast and the celebration of the Lord's Supper. And then, well, we'll have a little bit of bread and it'll get taken out into the rabble in the court. And are we really looking like the family of God, of one family, and we're not paying attention to slave or free, Jew or Greek? No. It's all stratified. It's all this distinction. That's the way the world was. It's not the way that the church was supposed to be. Aelius Aristides unabashedly explains the Roman position. The existence of inferiors is an advantage to superiors, since they will be able to point to those to whom they are superior. That's how society was. As much as we moved away from that, it is the influence of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And right at the center of that influence in this contest is Jesus' humble way and the teaching of humility. We modern Christians have been conditioned not to let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Sometimes we still fall into the trap, but we see humility as a virtue. And it's probably getting easier for us. When I originally wrote this, it's hard for us to conceive of a society where people unabashedly boasted about their accomplishments. But it may not be that way so much anymore. You know, I mean, how many awards ceremony shows do we have for celebrities? I mean, and it's, they want to be seen, they want their awards, all of these things. They had books on how to boast. They saw it as right and appropriate. And then there's this. And they viewed any form of identifying with a lower social class as an attack on the norms of society, decidedly base and non-virtuous. And the call to humility was that call. And it was the honor-shame culture and the central feature of their society, which was opposed to and antithetical to the call of humility that we find in the New Testament. Now, we hear the word pride, and out of our Christian understanding, we say this is not good. We also know that in the ancient world, they had opposition to pride, and they called it hubris. But their idea of pride, which gets defined by this word hubris, was a little bit different than ours. When we think of pride, we will immediately associate it with the idea of boasting, bragging, self-promotion. And we will look at those features and we will see them as a negative. None of those ideas were associated with hubris. They were all associated with just appropriate functions of how any citizen would try to elevate their honor, especially if they have reasons to and they can do it artfully. Hubris was really about rejecting the idea that you are reaching up into a higher social status than what you deserve. And so the basic stories are where humans try to reach up into the gods and become a god, and then they get thumped down because that's not something that's appropriate. But when you look at it, their basic critique of pride was this idea of trying to keep people in their places. Pretty convenient, isn't it, if there's 600 of you at the top and you wanted to keep the 49 million plus down below you. When we go back into the ancient world, it's always through this lens of this honor-shame culture. And even the Greco-Roman understanding of pride gets twisted a little bit and is not quite the same thing that we're thinking of. Or it's not quite the same thing that the Bible is thinking of. From a biblical perspective, pride was a problem. It was something endemic to Greeks, Romans, Jews, and Christians, especially in the status-conscious world of the first century. The competition for honor invariably led to arrogance, pride, and selfishness. There was a general callousness to the plights of those of lower status. They were dehumanized and only had worth so far as it gave opportunity for the reputation of the great to be advanced. Honor, shame, glory, status, privilege, greatness, and pride are at the heart of the contest between Greco-Roman society and the gospel of Jesus Christ. Leadership and humility became central issues in this contest. The only way to fully appreciate leadership and humility in the New Testament is in the light of the context of honor and shame. That's one of my main arguments that I'm making is that when we come and we try to understand this, we need to understand honor, shame of the ancient world and how it influenced this contest between the gospel and the call of humility. Now we're going to turn and we are going to examine 4 texts. Today, I think at this point, because we're at 7:10, we're probably just going to get through 1. And this is where we're going to see an intersection of issues surrounding leadership and issues surrounding humility. And we're going to see how the New Testament, the teachings of Jesus in particular, help shape our expectations of just what all of this really means. 3 of the passages that we will look at will come directly from the Gospels and the teachings of Jesus. And then the 4th will come from Philippians chapter 2. Our first one is Mark chapter 10, verses 42 through 45. If you have your Bibles, I invite you to pull them out. I will read for you the passages. Just so you know, this is a significant passage in so like when there is a part where there are certain things that get said that have very strong resonance of defining the way of Jesus Christ. This is one of them. This passage occurs in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew 20, 25 through 28, Luke 22, 25 through 30. I'm going to be examining Mark 10, 42 through 45. Now, there is an immediate backdrop to the words of Mark 10, 42 and 45. I'll read it for you in a minute, but let me give you the backdrop. And it's one that's coming right out of this honor-shame culture. The immediate backdrop to this passage was John and James, and they were pursuing the best seats at the eschatological banquet of the Messiah. They're looking forward. They believe that Jesus is the Messiah and that ultimately he is going to win and establish God's kingdom on earth. And when that final victory happens, that there will be a great banquet. And so John and James are there. And they say, let one of us sit at your right hand and the other one at your left hand in glory. We want the 2 best seats in the house. To modern ears, we hear this and we just think, oh my goodness, you have to be kidding me. They just asked that? I mean, how could they ask that? I mean, what were they thinking? The disciples of Jesus, and how long have you been with him, and what's going on? Now, if we have any sort of a reaction that when they ask that question, they should have known better for asking that question, it's because we're reading that passage through the assumptions of humility and the egalitarianism that comes through the gospel of Jesus Christ. It assumes the virtue of humility, and then our modern assumption about not climbing over other people and not, trying to do the self-promotion isn't the best thing. Hallerman observes, James and John were doing what their culture had taught them to do from infancy, namely to do everything within their power to enhance their honor and that of their extended family. John and James' request, no Roman person hearing that story would have blinked. They would have done the same thing. It's what the culture taught them to do. The radical and truly surprising remark, at least to the ancient listeners, was the response of Jesus to their request. And my finding is that most people, we've been so enculturated by the gospel, and humility has become a virtue in our society, that when we hear Jesus' words, we don't hear them as shocking. We just agree with them. Yeah, this sounds like the Christian way, a good way. Not everybody follows this way, but I'm not surprised Jesus says this. And this is just that part where when we come to this passage, we are not hearing it the way that they would have heard it. They would have heard it as shocking. What is he just saying? You have to be kidding me. This is what he says. You know that those who were regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. This is one of the key passages of the Gospels where Jesus himself explains the purpose of his ministry, why he's here. And in this passage, it is directly related against the honor-shame culture. It has to do about being first and great, which are leadership words in the New Testament. And the way that is offered is actually the way of humility. That you, if you want to be great, and you're seeking the highest status, you're going to identify in the lowest status, and you're actually going to take the position of a slave in society. And this is the thing that nobody in the ancient world promoted, nobody in the ancient world wanted to do, everybody despised. It was a rejection of the entire system of the ancient world. Jesus understood the honor-shame culture of Roman society. Leadership in the Roman Empire was not reflective of our modern understandings and definitions of leader. This is the part where leadership, my guess would be many of you have read some leadership books at some point in your life. Or you've at least had some leadership theory and ideas. It has become quite the industry. There are lots of books on leadership. And our working assumptions and definitions of what a leader are much different than the way that they viewed it in the ancient world. I'll give you a definition of a great book called The Art of Leadership by Max Dupree. And in it, here is the way that he defines a leader. A leader is somebody who defines reality, says thank you, and becomes a servant and a debtor to those that they are leading. That entire definition of leadership would have been just unrecognizable to the ancient world. Leadership was primarily a means of achieving honor and expressing superiority. It was motivated primarily from selfish ends and calloused hearts, which were culturally acceptable in that day. But Jesus comes and he says this is not how leadership is to be exercised among his followers. Literally what he says here is not so with you. Now here's what's interesting. In Greek, that not so is even stronger than what you get in translation. Because in Greek, there's two ways to do a negation. One way would be what's called a subjective negation, and it's that it might not be so among you. And the other, it would be called an objective negation, and it's stating the reality. This is not who you are. You know the way that the Gentiles lord it over and the way they exercise authority. This is not who you are. If you're with me, this is not us. This isn't how we do it. Commenting on this distinction of negation, Reinhard Faldmeyer explains, it is not an exhortation that says, you ought not to be this way. It is a statement of fact. It is not so among you. This is not something where the difference in how we regard power is something desirable. He is saying it is different. Now, Neri F. Santos, in Slave of All, he argues convincingly that Jesus' teaching in this passage was rhetorically structured to shock and unsettle the norms of Roman society. Jesus said all of this on purpose, and he said it in a way that everybody listening would be sitting there going, did he just say what I think he said? Is he really serious that he wants us to become servants? Is this really what it's supposed to be? And it was done on purpose because Jesus knew that he had to attack one of the most deeply enculturated and entrenched values in their entire life and dislodge it to present a different way to power and a different way of being. And that different way of being is actually the way of humility. Now, in this passage, you never hear the word leader and you never hear the word humility. But this passage is all about leadership and power and greatness and who's first, which was the leadership words, and who are going to lead the way in the kingdom of God. And it is all pointing to a way of being that is actually what I'm going to argue ultimately is the definition of humility. He was trying to help them grasp the seeming paradox that the way to greatness is through service, and the one who wants to be greatest must become the lowest slave of all. Further, when Jesus said the Son of Man has come, he was pointing back to Daniel 7. And when he's pointing back to Daniel 7, there's a story in Daniel 7. Daniel has a vision about what's going to unfold in the future. And there are 4 empires, and they are all beastly. Now, humans are created in the image of God. And so a human being reflects the nature of God. These kingdoms that are coming won't. But there's a promise. These 4 beastly kingdoms that are going to ravage the earth. The Son of Man is going to come. And he will do battle, and he will ultimately defeat the beastly kingdoms. And this is the Messiah. And Jesus identifies himself. He's the one who is going to overcome the kingdoms of this world, and he is going to establish the kingdom of God. But I want you to see part of the contrast here. The way of the world ends up looking beastly. The way of Jesus is the way of true humanity. And so when when Jesus is making this statement about the Son of Man, and he's going back, and the context here is the context of Daniel. He's showing us the way. Here's the way to reflect the image of God. This is the way of true humanity. In Mark's gospel, this discussion comes as the climax of 3 passion predictions where Jesus spoke plainly about his purpose. 3 times in Mark, he tells his disciples it's necessary for the Son of Man to go to Jerusalem and to die. This occurrence is the 3rd. It's the climax. It's the place where he states more clearly than anywhere else in this gospel what he came to do. And what he came to do was to exercise humble leadership by doing for us what we could not do for ourselves, and to lead the way towards the cross and through the cross and then to the other side. This is about true leadership. This is about true humanity. And at the heart of true leadership is a way of being that's characterized by humility, which actually enables us to love in the way that God created us to love. We hear that true greatness expresses itself through service And for the first time, we hear why it was necessary for Jesus to give his life over to death. He is giving his life as a gift, as a ransom, so that he can set all of us free. Even though a literal translation would produce neither the word leader nor humility, in this passage those ideas are being addressed throughout. Indeed, because of the veiled prediction of the cross is also given, where Jesus died a slave's death, here is all the raw material for Paul's teaching in Philippians 2. And we're going to dig into Philippians 2, but if it's not on the top of your head, in Philippians 2, Paul is calling the church in Philippi, in the face of the rising persecution, to go the way of humility. Not to consider others better than yourselves, but in humility, or not to put your self-concerns first, but in humility consider others better than you and take the position of a servant. And then he says, in the very same way of Jesus, who did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but instead he humbled himself, taking the form of a servant, becoming in the form a human being, and that a slave, and then even dying. And right there in all of that, this Mark 10 passage is all in the background. All Paul's doing is basically riffing off of what Jesus has already taught, and he's applying it to them so that they can hear and understand, this is the way of the Master. Anyone who exercises authority on Jesus' behalf must focus on service in place of self-promotion. Again, instead of ruling like Caesar, and Caesar, there would be a demand for sacrifice, there would be coercive power, there would be threats to harm if you don't do what I tell you to do, and there would be demands of tribute. And Jesus comes and he does none of those things. He invites us to faith. He woos us to trust. Remember what I said last week about the language of Jesus? It's never the authoritarian tone of the emperor, but instead it is the language of invitation. Keep these commands, guard these commands, guard your hearts, come and follow me. Godly power, Jesus was providing instead a new example of true greatness and true leadership. Godly power is exercised by stepping down into positions of a servant. And those who aspire to true greatness, and I'm going to argue that's true leadership, will end up being slaves of all. We also need to remember in this deeply, that to hear all of what he's saying through the deeply stratified classism of Greco-Roman society. No one, absolutely no one, aspired to be a slave. No one wanted to step down the class ladder into lower social ranks. According to the Romans, to think that way was perverted. It was, in fact, the ancient world's definition of humility, and they despised it. For the Romans, all that could mean was humiliation. And the fallen powers of this world did everything in their power to humiliate the Lord of glory. And you see, right here we can hear the scorn of the moralists who would say that that entire way of life is ridiculous. It's absurd. Nobody should do it, and to think that way is to demean yourself, and it is to have an absurd way of thinking. Remember, the cross was foolishness to the Greeks and a stumbling block for Jews. It was foolishness because it made no sense of their society. And you're seeing right here the contest between the gospel of Jesus Christ and the value system of the ancient world. And Tapaforsune, they saw it as weakness of mind, paucity of heart, lowliness of character, and Jesus is saying the exact opposite. This is the way of true greatness. This is the way to exercise power. This is the way for us humans to be. And now I want you just to think for a second about what happens. Jesus is taken to the cross, and they do everything they can to humiliate him. And what we end up seeing is the glory of the Lord. we see what true humanity is supposed to look like. Do I want to go the way of self-promotion and look like Caesar who brags about himself? Or do I want to look something like Jesus? And I know it's not going to be easy. But is there anything more beautiful than the one who has all power and all authority, who says, I love you, I'm for you, I'm with you, I'm identifying in every way, and in fact, I'm taking all that is yours onto me, and I'm dying in your place. That's the power of the gospel. And it's right at the center of the contest of just power struggle between the worldly power that is corruptive and corrupting and destructive, and the power of Christ, which is generative and loving and liberating. And it is the way of humility. For Jesus, the only greater first person, a person qualified to lead and exercise authority in God's name, is the one who knows that he or she is subordinate to the will of God, using power by God's will and God's way. And I believe Jesus is claiming even more truth in this passage. The power that is based on coercive force is not the way of God's people. It is subhuman, perverting and corrupting God's image bearers. It's beastly, like Daniel 7. On the other hand, true greatness is the willingness to not think of one's own advantage and reputation, coupled with a desire motivated by love to position oneself in service to others. This should characterize all Christian service. It should be the characteristic mark of what true humility is, and it should be the way of all Christian leadership. So, I went a minute over, sorry about that, but I was aiming for that finish up time. Next week we're going to jump right into another scripture passage where we're going to see the collision between leadership and humility and the issues of the honor-shame culture. And if you want a little preview, we're going to be in Matthew 18, verses 1 through 5. And invite you to read those in preparation for next week. And let me see here. If you want to read the other passage, John 13, verses 1 through 17, the foot washing of Jesus. We should cover both of those passages in our next talk. So thank you for tonight. Have a wonderful night, and God bless.